Today on Kick the Fog, some trash can trauma. Hello and welcome to Kick the Fog, the show that is all things Halloween. My name is Pat Jones. Today I'm going to show you how I built one of my favorite props, the trash can trauma. This is an idea that's been around for quite some time, and for those that might not be familiar with it, it is a monster that's hiding inside an everyday type object, in this case a trash can. This is important because a trash can is normally nothing special. Anyone who looks at a trash can will usually just acknowledge its presence and then promptly ignore it. So the beauty of this is you have a monster hiding inside an object that most everyone will ignore, and you can hide it in plain sight. When I first saw this prop was back in the 90s, and I believe it was created by a gentleman named Carl Chetta. I've seen many designs for this prop over the years, including some very simple designs where the lid of the trash can was attached to the top of the monster's head and it simply popped up. Carl's trash can idea also had an arm that extended out of the trash can as well, which I think takes this prop to a whole new level. I built one of these about 15 years ago out of a bicycle pump, a door closer, some washing machine valves, and a mess of plastic tubing and cable clamps connecting it all together. It was inexpensive, which was great, and it worked out well for quite a few years. But after a while, the seals in the bicycle pump started to go bad, and the door closer started rusting. And the final end came when a family of mice turned it into their winter home. So after a few years without one, I decided it was time to build another. But this time I set out to build a high quality one, heavy duty, using real air cylinders and air valves, a nice boo box controller, a motion detector, and a speaker for some cool sound effects as well. I knew it wouldn't be inexpensive to build, but it would be built right and hopefully would hold up for many years to come. So I ordered some items to get me started, including, of course, the main air cylinder. For that, I ordered a 3/4 inch bore, double-acting universal mount air cylinder with 15 inches of travel from frightprops.com. This will be the monster's spine, if you will, since not only will it hold the head, but will also push the head out of the trash can. Next, I ordered a mask for my monster, again from frightprops.com, and I went for a mask called He's Appealing. I picked this mask because not only did it have the look I wanted, but more importantly, it also came with hair and it wrapped around the back of the head. So it really gives a nice, realistic look in my opinion. I already had a styrofoam wig head lying around that I bought a few years before for a flying crank ghost that I built. But if needed, these can be purchased at any beauty supply outlet, especially one that sells wigs. With those items in place, it was time to figure out how to attach the head to the cylinder rod. The cylinder needs to go through the wig head to support the head and so that the head will pop out of the trash can. However, as you can see, the length of the head alone takes up much of the cylinder length, and that doesn't leave much cylinder left for the motion. Also, I chose a double-acting cylinder, so I would have full control over the force and speed of the cylinder in both directions, both up and down. So I wanted the cylinder to be able to return to the fully retracted position, and obviously that can't be done if half the cylinder rod is inside the styrofoam head. So how did I fix this? I used a threaded rod attached to the cylinder, and the threaded rod will be the part that's inside the wig head, leaving the air cylinder all alone and able to do its full range of motion. Since threaded rod most often comes in 3-foot sections, which was more than I needed, I was able to cut it to the perfect length to support my wig head, retaining my full 15 inches of cylinder rod travel. The threaded rod I bought was 1/4 inch by 28 pitch threaded rod. That is, the rod is 1/4 inch thick and the threads are 28 pitch, which is the same as the end of the cylinder rod. I also needed a female to female coupler to attach the threaded rod to the cylinder, along with some big 1/4 inch fender washers and some 1/4 inch nuts. So, time to stick the threaded rod through the head. These wig heads are nice because there's already a hole in the middle of them that goes about 3/4 of the way through the center of the head. So just by jamming the rod through the hole, the rod popped out in perfect position on the other end. Now I put a nut on the rod and threaded it down about as far as the head was tall, and then added a fender washer. Next I slid the head onto the rod and it sat nicely on the fender washer. I then added a fender washer to the top along with a nut on top and adjusted it so that I had about 3/4 of an inch or so sticking out the top of the head. The extra length on top of the head was needed to attach the mask, as well as a piece of curved aluminum that helps it smoothly push the lid open on the trash can, but we'll talk more about that later. Next, I've seen some folks stop here and leave a bit extra on the threaded rod on top of the head, and then simply attach the lid directly to the head of the monster itself. This doesn't affect the scare factor too much, but it does affect the look of it. For me personally, I wanted a more realistic look, so I wanted the lid to open and close naturally, just as if a real person was actually in the trash can. So now that I had my head mounted on the threaded rod, I needed to figure out how much rod to cut off. But first I had to get an idea of how to mount the cylinder, since that would dictate how long the rod will end up being. So let's take a look at the trash can. I bought a Rubbermaid Brute Rollout 50-gallon trash can. This one is expensive, but I bought it for several reasons. First of all, it was very thick and strong. Knowing that I was going to be mounting things inside it, having thick, sturdy plastic walls was important. I also liked the lid because it was attached and it self-aligns as it closes. Keeping the lid aligned can be important when the lid is not attached to the trash can itself, so this self-closing, self-aligning lid is a great thing to have already done. Now to mount the main cylinder. I took the cylinder and eyeballed where I might want to mount it. The idea here is that I wanted the head to be just inside the trash can when the cylinder is retracted and the lid is closed. Then when the cylinder is extended, in my case my cylinder extends 15 inches, I would end up with my monster head being 15 inches out of the trash can. So I needed to think about a few options here. Sure, I could be lazy and mount the cylinder directly to the bottom of the trash can, but then I would either end up needing a longer cylinder rod throw, or I would need a longer threaded rod attached to the cylinder to get the head up high enough to be out of the trash can. I found that either of these options add a bit of wobble and is something I did not want. I could get around this by buying a thicker air cylinder, but they can be pretty expensive and the workaround is pretty easy. And that workaround is to build a wood frame to hold the cylinder that will slip right into the trash can. To begin figuring out dimensions for the frame, I actually used a threaded rod and held it in the trash can against the cylinder at the proper height. So with the cylinder fully retracted, the monster head was just inside the trash can. I could have easily used a tape measure for this as well, but either way, the goal was to get a measurement of how high the base needed to be to get the monster head out of the trash can. After taking a measurement, mine ended up needing to be about a 5-inch vertical platform. So I began by measuring across the trash can for my base plate and came up with 16 3/4 inches. I then cut a 2x4 to length for my bottom plate. Remembering I needed to raise my cylinder up about 5 inches, I measured 3 2x4s stacked on top of each other and found out that that got me roughly 4 5/8 inches away from my 5-inch mark. This was a very easy way to get 3/8 inches away from my 5-inch height I wanted, so I said, close enough. You'll notice that the top 2 boards were not as wide as the bottom base plate. This is because I used that space to attach vertical wood braces to the sides for some support for the top part of the cylinder, which I'll show you in a little bit. So I started by centering the first board to the bottom board and then drilled some pilot holes so the wood didn't split, and then joined them together with screws. I used 2.5-inch drywall screws because I had them laying around, even though actual wood screws likely would have been better. But I don't think it matters much since all the force from the operation of this thing is going to be in a downward motion. After the first piece was secured, I attached the second piece of wood on top of that. Of course, if I had long enough screws, I could have attached all 3 boards in one shot, but again, I was simply using what I had lying around. Now to mount the cylinder to the platform using the flange mount, which I got from frightprops.com. The only issue I have with this mount is that it's not deep enough. The cylinder threads extend below the flat part of the flange mount so that it can't be mounted flat. This was easily fixed by drilling a hole in the wood for the cylinder to fit into, but wouldn't have been necessary if the flange were deeper. The other type of bracket I used was a foot bracket. A foot bracket attaches to the bottom, or in this case, the top of a cylinder, and enabled me to secure the cylinder to my cross wood brace. So we have a vertical piece on the left, a vertical piece on the right, and then a cross piece that our foot bracket will secure to. I measured the cylinder, and in my case, the sides ended up being 22 inches tall, so I cut both of those and secured them to the base. Now I measured for the horizontal cross piece, and in my case it ended up being 11 inches across. I used a 2x4 for the top horizontal piece and cut it to length. After cutting, I just friction fit it in place without screws and made sure everything lined up. With everything lined up and marked, remembering how I said that the cylinder stuck out past the flat part of the flange mount? To fix this, after centering and finding my mounting location, I traced the inside of the hole with a pencil. Then I drilled out that marked hole about 1/2 inch deep. This gave me room for the cylinder threads to sit into when I mounted the flange to the wood base. With the hole drilled and the cylinder and frame being secure and flat, I screwed everything in place. I started with the top horizontal wood piece. I then secured the cylinder to the flange with a 15/16 socket wrench. Then I measured and marked the holes to mount the flange to the wood and secured them with 1 1/4 inch screws. Then I secured the foot bracket to the top horizontal brace and I was all set. With the frame built, I placed it inside the can to verify the fit and see how well I did on my measurements. Remember that the top cylinder is roughly where the bottom of the head will be, so I made sure at this point that all measurements were good and that I was on the right track. You can also see here that the bottom of the frame will be secured to the trash can later with screws, but the top needed to be secured as well. I took a measurement of the distance between the frame and the side of the can on each side, and I cut a scrap 2x4 to length. My distances ended up being 3 3/8 inches for both sides. I cut 2 of those and friction fit them in place. I took a measurement and noticed that the pieces needed to be mounted 1 1/2 inches down from the top of the frame in order to sit properly against the side of the trash can because of the way it was molded. When I removed the frame, I noticed that 1 1/2 inches put me right in line with some other screws that I already had in place, so I moved it down to 2 inches total and mounted them there. After some pilot holes, I secured those pieces to the sides of the frame with wood screws. With the frame successfully test fit and looking good, it was time to measure and cut the length of the threaded rod. Keeping in mind the amount of threaded rod and cylinder rod that the coupler would accept, I made sure those dimensions were part of my measurements as well. Now, adding the distances to go through the styrofoam head, leaving a little extra on top, I made my cut. A quick tip, make sure your threaded rod has a nut on it already before you cut it, because after you cut the rod, the threads will likely be all messed up. You can then unscrew the nut over the damaged threads, and that will make the threads usable again. If you forget the nut, you can always run a nut the entire length of the threaded rod to fix the threads on the other end, but it sure is a lot easier if you have a nut close to where you cut to begin with. Now that the threaded rod was the proper length, I reattached the foam head to the rod using the fender washers and nuts. I snugged it up with just my fingers because too tight and you will squash the head. Next, I removed the frame from the trash can so it was easier to attach the coupler and threaded rod. When installing the coupler, I made sure to screw it on about halfway onto the cylinder rod, leaving the other half of the coupler available for the threaded rod. Now it was time for the mask. I put the mask on the foam head and got it lined up so it looked good. Then I felt the top of the mask and found where the rod was hitting the top of the mask and cut a small slit to allow the rod to come through the mask. I slipped a fender washer on top of the mask on the outside. This helped to grip the rubber mask and keep it facing forward with the help of some aluminum and a counterweight. For the aluminum, I used a piece of stiff but flexible aluminum that was 1/8 inch thick. I drilled a 1/4 inch hole in the aluminum on one end and bent it to a nice smooth arc and then mounted it to the top of the head on top of the fender washer and secured it with a 1/4 inch nut. I decided to use this aluminum with counterweight attached because this would accomplish 3 things. 1, it allowed the cylinder and head to push the lid open easily and smoothly as it moved upward. 2, the counterweight attached to the aluminum counters the force of the lid as the head rises and pushes the lid open. It tends to push the head a little bit forward. This counterweight tends to pull it back into place. And 3, it kept the head facing forward. So with the aluminum secured on top of the head, I put a scrap piece of 2x4 with an angle bracket and secured it to the rear of the trash can just below the bent aluminum. Then I drilled a hole and tied a piece of strong fishing line to the aluminum and ran it through the ankle bracket and then tied that to a large bolt to act as a counterweight. You can see here now that the head returns to the center position very easily and consistently. For that line, I used 36-pound Muskie Master fishing line, which I had lying around because that is what I use for my Axeworthy Flying Ghost. You have to be careful of your distance so that the line is long enough to allow the head to come fully out of the trash can, but not so long that it hits the bottom of the can when the head is fully retracted inside the can. Next, I began to mount the cylinder for the arm. Using one screw, I secured a 1x3 to the side of the can and drilled a hole through the length of the PVC for the arm. Then I could adjust the rear of the 1x3 until I was satisfied with the movement of the arm. Lowering the rear of the 1x3 allowed the arm to be completely inside and lower than the trash can lip so that the lid would close all the way, and yet still be higher than the lip and extend out of the can as it extended outward. After marking where I wanted it, I then removed the 1x3 from the can so that it was easier to mount the arm and the arm cylinder. Something to note when attaching the PVC arm, use a nylon lock nut to secure your PVC arm to the 1x3. This way you can get it snug so it moves nicely without binding, yet it won't loosen up over time. Do not over tighten it because it will bind up and the arm won't move freely. With the arm spinning freely, it was time to attach the arm cylinder, but this one had a throw of only 6 inches. In the end, I found out that the air cylinder only extended 4.5 of its 6-inch travel, so a 6-inch throw cylinder was plenty. I used the clevis mounting bracket to attach the front of the cylinder to about the halfway point across the PVC arm. This gives a nice smooth and not too fast motion to the arm and looks pretty realistic. To attach the rear of the cylinder to the 1x3, I used the rear pivot mount. I actually only used one of the 2 pieces of this mount. One piece of the mount was angled in such a way that it got in the way of the cylinder, but the other side of the mount didn't. So of course I used that one. I carefully lined up the cylinder so that when fully extended, the cylinder housing was hitting the PVC and not the cylinder rod itself, so that repeated use wouldn't cause any cylinder rod damage. With the cylinder rod moving back and forth freely, I put the cotter pin in the rear pivot mount bracket, and I was good to mount the arm assembly in the trash can. I put a few screws in from the outside of the trash can into the 1x3 to secure the arm in place. Next, I tested it out to make sure the head will clear the arm and that it swung freely. I was feeling pretty good at this point, but little did I know that I had already made a mistake at this point, which I discovered in a later step, and I'll show you that in a second. So with the arm secure, I then secured my entire frame the same way I did the arm, by putting some screws in from the outside of the can. With everything secure, it was time for the controller. The controller I started with was the Peekaboo FI104 prop controller, which of course, like all of the Fright Ideas controllers, worked great. But I later switched to the Peekaboo Plus because I wanted ambient sound and ambient animation. But for now, I mounted my controller and air control solenoid to a scrap piece of wood and connected them together. I then mounted them inside the back of the trash can. If you are unsure how to hook up your controller, just check out Fright Prop's awesome support pages on their website. They do a great job of documenting how the products they sell are connected and how they work. I then drilled a hole near the bottom so that I could get my 1/4-inch air line to the control valve. Later, I ran the power cord for the Peekaboo controller through this same hole. Now at this point, I have the Peekaboo controller and a single air valve controlling both the head cylinder and the arm cylinder. This caused an interesting issue because the smaller cylinder needs less air than the main cylinder. Therefore, it fully extended first. Also, because it needs less air and is under less pressure than the main cylinder, it stays extended longer than the main cylinder. This is a problem because the head needs to go up and open the trash can lid before the arm extends. And then when closing, the arm needs to retract before the lid comes down. Wanting to accomplish this with one valve, I used variable exhaust ports and added flow control unions to both cylinders to further control the flow of each. After adjusting the exhaust ports and flow valves to get the correct order of motion, I wasn't happy with the speed at which the cylinders had to move in order to achieve this operating order, at least in this valve configuration, having only one valve. So I decided a second air control valve was needed. At the same time, I decided I wanted ambient sound and ambient motion as well, so when I added the second air valve, I also upgraded the controller to the Peekaboo Plus. At this point, being excited about the new controller, I started messing with the ambient animation so I could get the lid to shake. Now, of course, some would argue that you lose the scare factor if you have a trash can shake before the monster pops out, and that could certainly be true. But I have found that the overall scare is just as, if not more effective with the ambient animation. I think this is because with the trash can shaking, a lot of people are terrified to even go near it in the first place, wondering what might happen if they do. You create more of a prolonged agony and then the eventual scare when they finally get the courage to approach it. Just like a scary movie, it's usually that ramping up suspense part that most people find just as scary as the actual scare part itself. I've also experienced that when some people see it shaking, they think that's all it could possibly do and approach with no worry whatsoever, only to be frightened when it finally does jump out. So it depends on what type of scare you want, and after trying both ways, I prefer the long agony type of scare with ambient animation. So anyway, back to the build. Now is time to add the left hand to the PVC. For this, I bought the Horror Hands Claw Pose left hand from frightprops.com, and I was pleasantly surprised on how realistic it looked and also how its color tone matched that of the mask I bought earlier. I used my Forster drill bit that I had been using to drill holes for my PVC cemetery fence and used it to make a hole inside the hand. Then I jammed the hand on the PVC for a test fit. This is when I discovered my mistake from earlier. When I lined up and estimated the position of the 1x3 that holds the PVC arm, I did not take into account the fact that the fingers of the hand bent downward. This made it so the hand didn't clear the top of the trash can. So I had a choice of adding a board underneath to tilt the board slightly or unscrewing and adjusting the 1x3 board that held the arm. I measured and figured that if I moved the 1x3 up any higher, then the lid would not close at all, so I chose to add a support board underneath the 1x3. This tilted it slightly. Well, actually, it just kept the arm from sagging down a bit, and of course added stability as well, which accomplished the main goal, which was getting the hand to clear the top of the can. With it tested and working, my young son came out and helped me by driving 2 screws to secure the wood in place. With that secured, we were ready to move on to the speaker for the audio. I bought marine speakers from monoprice.com, part number 8553, which is the 4-inch version of this speaker here. I'm not sure if they still make the 4-inch version because when I last looked, this 4-inch version was not listed on their website. But if they do, I highly recommend it as it was only $12.66 for the pair of them, which is roughly half the cost of the 5¼ inch version. However, even at $23, these speakers are a bargain because they are small, durable, they sound good, and yes, they can even get wet. The speakers came as a pair, and I'm only using one for the trash can, which will leave me an extra speaker for another project, which is great. They also came with a template, which I traced and then used a jigsaw to cut a hole for one of them in a scrap piece of wood. I then mounted the speaker in the scrap piece, soldered a few feet of speaker wire to speaker terminals, and stapled the wire to relieve any strain that might affect the terminals if the wire were pulled. Then I screwed the board to the top of the wood frame in the trash can, connected the speaker wires to the audio output of the peekaboo, and then added a strobe light and mounted that to the same board. And of course wired the strobe to the peekaboo as well. I also wired up a motion sensor and connected it to the peekaboo. I used the black motion sensor from frightprops.com and mounted it right in the little cutout in front of the trash can. Again, if you aren't sure how this stuff gets hooked up, check out Fright Props' awesome help pages. Then I attached the hand to the PVC with hot glue to keep it in place. I did this because I found that the hand was turning on the PVC, so I roughed up the PVC with some sandpaper and then hot glued the hand in place. After a few dozen test runs and the hand working great, I realized that the angle iron and hole that I drilled and mounted in the rear of the can that the string and the counterweight ran through was sharp, and it kept cutting the fishing line every 20 to 30 cycles or so. So remember the rear cylinder mount bracket that came in 2 pieces and I only used one of them to mount the arm cylinder? Well, I used the other side of that bracket as the hole for my string and counterweight because it was very smooth inside and I had it left over. I also replaced the musky line with regular fishing line because it was smooth, and that has been going strong ever since. I painted the aluminum on top of the head black to hide it. I was worried that this aluminum might be visible at night, but was very pleased to find out that I can't even really see it at all, even when I know what I'm looking for. This left me with one last issue to overcome. When the head popped, the lid opened, the lid flew backwards into the open position and stayed there. I needed a way to put a stop on the lid to keep it from going all the way back. So I drilled 2 holes in the lid on the left rear side, and then I ran some black musky line through the holes and tied it to a loop on the inside. Then I tied another length of string to the loop on the lid and ran it down to a zip tie that was looped through a hole in the speaker board. The reason I used a zip tie instead of just running the line directly to the wood inside the can was because the zip tie is a really easy and quick length adjuster. I tied the line at roughly the right point, then simply pulled the zip tie tighter to adjust the length of the line. I then ran the prop many times and tightened it just a little bit with a zip tie, test ran it again, tightened the zip tie, test ran it again, until the length of the line was perfect so that the lid did not go back too far. This sure beat tying, untying, and retying different lengths of line to get the length just right. And also the beauty of this is, in a few months or years when the line stretches, a simple notch or two on the zip tie and the line is again the perfect length. A note at this point about the scrap piece of wood I mounted the speaker in. Originally, this piece of wood was only for the speaker. That's all I thought this piece of wood would be used for. But as you can see here, I used that piece of wood for not only the speaker, but a place to mount the strobe light and also to mount the zip tie as well to keep the lid from popping back too far. Funny how something unplanned actually worked out in my favor, because this is normally not the case for me. Now at this point, I'd like to point out that I built this prop over several weekends, a few hours here and a few hours there, when I was working on other projects as well. I had so many different builds going on that I forgot that I had never put any clothes on my monster. When I went to get him out of the shed on Halloween day at 4 p.m., 2 hours until trick-or-treating, I realized he was naked. So I aimed to put a shirt on my monster and try to make him look like he had some sort of body, but I also needed to do it as quickly as possible. I started with the sleeve and hot glued it in place in 3 different points, and then used quite a bit of glue on the wrist to keep the shirt in place there as well. With that, I was done with the arm. Then I cut a shirt and hot glued the neckline to the neck of the monster, then spread it out and hot glued the left side and then right side as well, and gave it some test runs. With some test runs under my belt and the monster looking okay, I called it close enough, as I had to move on to other Halloween day setup. So I quickly programmed some ambient animation to go with my growling sound effects. Then I plunked it out in the driveway, hooked up the air, adjusted the pressure, and said good enough. I didn't have any time to get any footage of it working before Halloween, but here is some footage of it working against some of its many victims. There you go. So you get 2 pieces for that. Here it is again after Halloween was over, after I cleaned up. I drug it into the shed and finally filmed it doing one of its full cycles with ambient animation, with me triggering it at the end. So there you have it, my build of the trash can trauma. I got a lot of scares with this on Halloween night, and all the parents loved it as well. All the time and effort was definitely worth the end result. I wished at the time I had spent more time getting it just right, but even at the end, just tossing clothes on him, no one ever noticed. It still looked great and was very effective. Kids still ran screaming, and no one even noticed that the shirt wasn't quite perfect. Overall, I'm very happy with it. It held up perfectly and was very consistent. In other words, each and every time it activated, it behaved the exact same way, which I could not say for my previous model made out of inexpensive repurposed equipment. So to wrap it up, I'm going to say that I don't claim to know everything, and I'm certainly not saying that this is the way to build a trash can trauma. I'm only showing you how I built mine. I hope it helps you to build one too. If anyone has any comments or suggestions, please feel free to share them, and we can all learn to make a trash can trauma for ourselves. I hope this helps. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy Halloween.